And welcome to the Great Deception Podcast. I'm your host, Matt. Thanks for joining me. Tonight, we're going to look at part two, the Great Fires of 1871, all around Chicago, or around Lake Michigan, actually, which is very coincidental. And we started in the first one, we were looking at Chicago. This one, we're going to look at Chicago a little bit more, and we're going to get into Peshtigo, into Washington. But first, guys, I want to thank you for leaving reviews, 5-star. I don't care what you say in it. Leave a good review. It gets us in the algorithm, gets more people to the show. The more people to the show, the more we can get the message out there. So thank you all for leaving a message. And I'm going to try and read a message on each one of the Great Deception shows. Probably not Monday Night Master Debaters, but definitely the Great Deception. So here's one from FC7. I enjoy the podcast. The subject matters are enjoyable, especially about Tartaria and the World's Fairs. One small issue I have is the constant snorting and bodily noises coming from one of the hosts. Not only that, but it's gulping drinks directly into the microphone makes listening for an extended period of time difficult. I'm sensitive to noises like that and wear earbuds when I listen. I suggest going back to podcasting 101 school and learning a little thing called a mute button. Noted, my friends. It was probably one of the guests. And, you know, it's not a host. I run a solo operation here. So you would get it every episode if it was me. So it's probably one of the guests. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I hope the subject matter was able to overcome some of the auditory issues. And we'll work on that, right? Editing. It's one of my weaknesses, one of the things I'm working on. And one of the things that is going to improve the quality of the podcast. So, hey guys, perfect time for that. Patreon.com/The Great Deception Podcast. Guys, we've got a bunch of people hopping on the Patreon now. I want to thank Matthew and Christopher for hopping on in the last week or so. Guys, it's great. We're getting more people in there. The interactions getting real good in there. And this Friday, October 28th, we will have our monthly patron-only Zoom call. We start at 8:30 Eastern. Last time we went till midnight, and I had to just cut it because I had to let the poor dog out. But yeah, it's great. Get to talk whatever you want to talk about. We can talk old world. You guys want to bring topics, you want to bring pictures, whatever you want to bring to go over and talk about. It's a lot of fun, a lot of cool people in there. So I recommend hop in the Patreon, hop on the wagon. Patreon.com, The Great Deception Podcast. And again, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Christopher, for hopping on board. I appreciate it. It really helps the show grow. Now, guys, one of the things I like to do, and you know this, is when I find a show I like to promote it. When I hear a good episode that I think people should listen to, I like to promote it. And right now, guys, go check out Operation Red Pill. Jason and Christopher are killing it over there. I hadn't heard about them until they were on the Dangerous World podcast with Ryan, and they did an episode about Marvel and the occult, and it blew my mind. I wasn't into the Marvel movies, the series much. It was just, it was a bunch of grown-ups running around in tights. But then they brought their angle to it, and now I watched Avengers, Infinity War the other night, and I tried watching Endgame last night, but I passed out. So go check out Operation Red Pill on the Dangerous World podcast. I believe it's episode 297 on the Dangerous World feed. And then on the Operation Red Pill feed, Operation Red Pill podcast, go check out their Halloween episode. Halloween's coming up. It will change the way you look at Halloween and all of the little, rituals associated with Halloween. Damn, man. wild shit. It blew my mind. Go listen. Operation Red Pill. I believe it's episode 30 for that one on theirs. And then the last one I'm going to promote today is my buddy Andrew over at the Politics and Punk Rock podcast. This guy did an episode, Choices, it's called. Go give it a listen. This is a must listen for everybody because everyone needs to hear this message that Andrew put out there about we have choices. Everything in our lives is about the choices we make. And that's where, if you're going to find peace, you have to find it within your choices. And Andrew does such a good job laying it out. I'm not going to do it justice right here. So go check it out. Now, what do we want to get into tonight? Well, we're going to get into a little bit of the world, the Chicago of 1871. Now, remember, when we look at this fire, right, it's not the entire city of Chicago. There's a lot of the district that's hit, but not the entire city, as we're led to believe in a lot of the tales. The exaggeration of this thing. But again, some crazy things have happened. What did we see in the first? The first episode, when we went through it, we saw a couple different things. We saw there was a fire, not only in Chicago, but in Washington, Michigan, Canada, all around Lake Michigan. Fire simultaneously breaking out at around on the same day, around the same time. And Chicago was the least of the damage. Now, monetarily, it was probably the most because of the density of everything that was destroyed. But there was 4 million acres destroyed on that day, or over the course of the next 3 days while the fires burned. Stone buildings were turned to ash. One large house was observed being lifted 85 feet in the air. It's just, I mean, there's tales, first-hand accounts of victims who had no burns or injuries. They were just suffocated. So that means all the oxygen was sucked out of the air, which is, I mean, just think of the power of that. And most of the people survived. They went into the woods, not to the other towns. So does that mean it was a forest fire in Chicago? In Wisconsin, it was. I mean, Wisconsin, it destroyed, I think it was a total of 9 towns. So, I mean, we're looking at massive devastation there. But the conditions were ripe for fire, right? There had been a drought prolonged throughout the summer that year, extending into the fall, and there were lots of hot and dry temperatures. On top of that, a lot of Chicago was wood frame. Now, to counter that argument, all right, I want to go back here, because when we go back here, let's take a look now. Okay, this is Chicago pre-1871, pre-fire. Look at this building. Interesting. Let me stop and let me just reshare that so you guys are getting this. So I want to make sure you're getting these images here. Okay, so we have this is the arcade building. Then we're going to have the Pullman building. I mean, these are not wood structures, guys. This is the Chamber of Commerce. We have the courthouse here just after they did an addition in 1870. And this is the view from the courthouse. Now, again, this is downtown. This isn't where the shanties were and where all the village, but this is, a lot of this was destroyed. It's crazy to think. Look at these buildings. They're not wood. Now, one of the things you have to consider, though, and one of the things I have found in some of my research is that some of these buildings, although they may appear to be brick on the outside, or like this one, some of them are terracotta covered wood. So they just put clay and terracotta and cement over wood structures, supposedly. Now, the issue I have with some of that is if you look at some of the old buildings, they bricked over and cemented over cement in a lot of the old buildings. So to just assume that it was all done over wood, you can't make that jump. Now, is it possible? Yes. I want you all, I just want you to understand that we're not going to make any broad generalizations here like some people do, because I want to be as accurate as possible. Now, another interesting thing that they did just before the fire, they completed the tunnel under the Chicago River. So in 1870, they had a tunnel that would go under the Chicago River, a feat in itself. Now, this is the Waterworks Tower. This was destroyed in the fire. All right, so now let's get back to the maps. We'll start seeing the different areas that were destroyed in the fire. So what do I want to do? I want to just let you guys see, and this is one here. So let's see if we share this. Okay, so what we have here is this is from a book called The Great Fire of Chicago. And guys, if you're in the Patreon, I will put this PDF over there along with the PDF of the Chicago and the Great Conflagration. And the Harper's Weekly article that I reference will be over there. Anything that any material that I use for the show, I will put over there, or I will put the links in the show notes. So that's one of the perks of being a patron also, is you get these documents if you want them. So let's take a look here. At times it seemed but the work of a moment for the fire to enter the south end of the buildings fronting Randolph Lake and Water Streets and reappear at the north doors and windows, belching forth in fierce flames, which often licked the opposite buildings, and then the flames belching from buildings on both sides of the street would unite and present a solid mass of fire, completely filling the street from side to side and shooting up 100 feet into the air above the housetops in their mad career. Thus was this street after street filled with flames and fire, and the exultation of the fire fiend was given vent to roar, which can only be equaled by combining the noise of the ocean when its waters are driven up the tempest upon a rocky beach with the howl of the blast. Huge walls would topple and fall into the sea of fire without apparently giving a sound, as a roar of the fierce element was so great that all the minor sounds were swallowed up, and the fall of walls was only perceptible to the eye and not the ear. Think about how loud that fire must be. You're not hearing these buildings crumbling, these walls falling apart, brick walls. If our readers will call to their mind the fiercest snowstorm in their experience and imagine the snow to be fire, and it surged hither and thither before the fury of the wind, they will be able to form a faint conception of the flames as they raged through the streets of our doomed city. Many of the buildings situated along the South Water Street buried their red-hot rear walls in the water of the river. Yeah, I can't see that. Shoot. All right. Let's see. I got to minimize this, guys. Sorry. And then it says, the water of the river, into which they plunged with a big hiss, like unto nothing earthly, throwing up a billow of water which would gradually subside until the walls would follow. The heat was so intense at times from some of the burning buildings that they could not be approached within 150 feet, which accounts for the manner in which the fire worked back and often against the wind. The fire, after reaching the business portion of Randolph and South Water Street, leaped the river on the north side in an incredibly short space of time, and thence among the wooden buildings on that side, reached the lake shore after touching block after block, happy dwelling after happy dwelling, with its fierce blast. A scene of more powerless efforts to fight an enemy was never presented than that of this. The people trying to baffle the fire fiend and combat was not of long duration. For the people bowed their heads in anguish of spirit and suffered the fiend in an untrammeled sway. And well and thoroughly as has done his work, and nothing of the past history of civilized nations chronicles any efforts of his to which this present can be compared. So in all future time, the great Chicago fire, when mentioned, will bring to the heart of its participants a pang of anguish, to future generations a smile of everything that is frightful and terrible. While there are a great many instances of generous devotion on the part of rich and poor individuals to the destitute, there are painful instances of meanness and selfishness. So what we see there is it's just not good. Okay, I want to switch over to stop share. We're going to go back here. I'm going to minimize this. Okay, I want to get you guys back into the Chicago and the Great Conflagration, because what we have there is it's so interesting when we start looking at this, because there's so many different angles. Now, what was lost, right? You lost buildings, you lost lives, you lost livelihoods, you lost history in this fire. And that's what's not paid much attention to: the loss of records, the loss of libraries. And what we'll see here is that there's a gentleman named Mr. Arnold, and another gentleman, I can't remember his name. I want to say Scott, but I don't think that's right. But they had libraries. This Mr. Arnold had just finished, not just finished, because this is 1871 and Lincoln was killed in, I believe, 65. He was working, he had firsthand interviews with Lincoln and people of Lincoln's administration, and he had this massive library. And says in his library was perhaps a full a collection of the books and pamphlets in relation to slavery, the rebellion, the war, and President Lincoln as existed in any private hands. These, with many rare and curious relics, prints, and engravings, have all perished. Right? He tried to save it, and he tried to save everything, and that was his downfall. Mr. Arnold tried to save everything. He tried to save his house, tried to save his collection, and in doing so, lost it all. And when we're talking collections, right? Like his collection, I mean, it's great. Let's go down to and there it says, look at, during all this time, the fire was falling in torrents. There was literally a rain of fire. I mean, think about this, guys. Like they described before, the noises, the sound, and then you have all this chaos of the people running around, what it must have been like. Yeah, and this is just talking about how people tried to save stuff. And it said the sands, which is the beaches, from the government pier to north to Lil's pier, distance of 3/4 of a mile. So in 3/4 of a mile, were covered with men, women, and children, some half clad in every variety of dress, with the motley collection of effects which they sought to save. And that's what you see, all these people saving weird stuff. But even still, the air was full of cinders and smoke. The wind blew heated sand, worse than any sirocco. And sirocco is a warm wind. I found out after looking up that. I didn't know what that word was. But I want to get over here to, here it is, Mr. Perry Smith. Sorry, it wasn't Scott. A well-known railroad manager and capitalist lost a library valued at $50,000 and noted for the superb bindings of its volumes, many of which Mr. Smith had just brought from Europe. So this is European history, right? Which is a lot of these people's history because they were transplants. But $50,000 at the time, guys, is about $1.2 million today. So we're not talking about small, meaningless collections. Okay. So what I want to look at now are some of the victim accounts. And what we have here are some, just some gruesome. I can't imagine what these people were going through. So here was one of great suffering after all, suffering which the victims, exhausted by hunger, blistered with heat, and chilled by water, still in a terrible suspense about the missing ones and deprived of unusual stimulus of the sudden onset of the night before, indeed weakened by the reaction of all the excitement as well as the other causes mentioned, were but merely poorly able to bear. Okay, so here we go. The outlet to the west or north being shut off by fire, and that by the south by water, the prisoners had only to stand their ground, keep their vitality aglow, and as best they could, and trust God to deliver them from the fiery furnace. The scene, so now we'll bring you to the cemetery, right? There's people that run into the beaches to get as close to the river as possible. There's people in the river. There's people being burned in the river because the fire's jumping the river, as we saw in the last clip. I mean, this is just pure mayhem, and something. This has got to feel like hell on earth. So the scene in the cemetery was a very weird one, as may be imagined. It is an old burial ground for which many of the bodies had been removed, leaving some of the old headstones scattered. All right. Scattered about many. Here we go again. Sorry. Many with their mounds still among the thick undergrowth of grass and small oak trees. By nightfall on Monday, there could not have been less than 30,000 men, women, and children huddled within the ghostly enclosure. So it's 30,000 men, women, and children in the cemetery. Think about that idea. That's just mind-blowing. The eyes of all looked as if they had suffered from ophthalmia, black and red with smoke and cinders, till they all were almost blind. There were piles of every sort of furniture that ever came to the city. It says, meantime, the roaring ocean of flame nears us. It bombards even the sacred necropolis with its hellish missiles. Now, think about that description. It's bombarding with missiles. It's a very war, and like I said, a hellish scene. Everywhere among the dead leaves fall the blazing embers. The torches alight head first upon the hollow graves. Groups dodge and run, and here and there a fire is kindled by the brands, and there is struggle to stamp it out. The fire howls up to heaven and bends and bows over the cemetery like an iris of doom. The park is lighted up by 1,000,000 fire balloons sailing over endless succession. Now the dead house is afire, and shudder horror runs through the multitude. It defies the extinguishers. It burns until it is consumed. But it was happily tenantless. Think about that. Fire balloons, 1,000,000 fire. The park lighted up as by 1,000,000 fire balloons. Think about what the sky must have looked like. At the head of the grave stands usually a cheap pine headboard, and these in many instances are burned up. And in a few cases, and the fire burrows down into the peaceful tenement beneath, for the drought has been so severe that the very soil is combustible. The ground is catching fire. It's burning the people that are in the graves. At last, the raging sea sweeps by the northbound, following the line of houses, and the most reckless or courageous of these elfin junketers lie down upon the graves to sleep, the queerest camp that had ever gathered under heaven. At 2 o'clock came the blessed rain, and the multitude shivered with chill while they welcomed it. It was a dreadful night in the cemetery. A muffled moan of discomfort went through it from night to morning. Hundreds, doubtless, contracted fatal diseases in the exposure. It might not to forget in this world or the next, a night in which demon of fire invaded the realm of the quiet angel of death. I mean, just think about that description. So morbid. Now we're going to get into some of the victims. Okay. And that's where you start wondering about the heat that's generated by these flames. How does it get this hot? And one of the things we're going to get into after we look into all these firsthand accounts is some alternate theories that have been presented about what could have caused this to be so hot, because it just does not seem to make sense as to, how does iron melts? So again, we're in the Chicago and the Great Conflagration book from 1872. The rapidity of flames alone, however, would not have caused the destruction of so many lives, but for the combination of other circumstances which worked fatally. There was a general hegira across all the bridges leading to the west side. Chicago Avenue was the best of the thoroughfares tending in this direction. Through this, the people poured like the mountain torrent through its narrow gorge. All at once, when the fiercest blast, the monster furnace, had begun to sweep through this section with heat which threatened death to thousands, it was discovered that the bridge was for the time impassable. The people were rushing, tumbling, crowding, storming toward it in terribly irresistible numbers. Those who were nearest the burning bridge could not turn back because of the pressure from the frantic multitude. They attempted to make a stand by passing along the word to beat back the onsurging mass of men, women, and horses and wagons. But the task was simply impossible, as at the rearmost of the crowd were now fairly lashed by the flames and could not stop. Whether the foremost hundreds would or not, they were forced to turn to northward to attempt to escape through the burning streets to North Avenue, half a mile further north. So they had to go through half a mile of flames where there was another bridge. Into the vortex of flame they plunge. May heaven send them guidance through it. Out from the vortex of flame, some 200 of them never emerge. May heaven send sweet mercy to their souls. Alas, they knew not, for the streets or lanes had an outlet for some 300 yards or more. Ooh, that's rough. I mean, that's just a nasty, nasty scene. And here's the amazing part, though. The total number of deaths caused by the fire is estimated by Coroner Stevens and Dr. Ben C. Miller, county physicians, at near 300. It's only 300 people passed. That's amazing for what we just heard. The dead bodies gathered up as soon as possible by the coroner and given the interment at the county burying ground. That officer brought in on the second day after the fire some 70 bodies or fragments of bodies, which were placed in an extemporized morgue and exposed to the view of such public as chose to see the horrid sight. Okay, so that's just, it's just so awful. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the doomed city. Okay. And what I want to show you here in the doomed city is we want to go down and look at what happened during this chaos. Okay. What was going on? Well, it says incendiaries at their hellish work. They meet speedy and deserved punishment. Many are shot and hung to lampposts. A short shrift, a swift retribution. Interesting incidents during the subsequent to the fire. Okay. So what we have here, there can be no doubt that incendiaries helped the fearful destruction to both life and property by setting fire to houses, stables, and thus adding them to the flames that might have sooner been stayed. In many cases, their own lives paid the forfeit for their dastardly work, the people in these cases being the judges and jurors. The engraving on the cover represents a scene which is said to have transpired. A man was caught in the act of setting a house on fire, was seized after a desperate struggle, crucified to the wooden pavements of one of the thoroughfares by the excited multitude. Crucifixion was certainly not too terrible a death for the wretch who would thus add to the general destruction of life and property. So this is what we have, vigilante justice going on. They're catching people stealing, they're catching people setting fires, and they're taking justice into their hands. The citizens had a terrible siege of watching terror and excitement during the fire, as many attempts had made to burn the remainder of the town. Law was a short shrift and a strong rope. The authorities had instructions to shoot down everyone found using the incendiary's torch, and this, as seen from the following, was done in a number of instances. The ruffians and thieves from other cities poured in to secure their share of the plunder and did not scruple the torch to gain new ground for their nefarious purposes. Some of them paid a sure and speedy penalty, and none condemned the citizen patrols who, when a villain was taken red-handed in such a crime, sped him to a land where his taste for fire might be indulged solely at his own cost. A boy attempted to help on the conflagration by igniting a clothesline saturated with kerosene and throwing it into a building on 32nd Street. He received his deserts at the hands of a fireman who saw the act. Okay. A man, name unknown, was shot by a Negro at the corner of State and 32nd Streets. His offense was that he set fire to the building to obtain better opportunities for pillage. Bridget Hickey was arrested for setting fire to a barn in the rear house of a Burnside Street. By some mistaken idea of clemency, she was not hanged. 2 men were caught trying to set fire to a Jesuit church on the west side, were disposed of without ceremony, and the onlookers were pleased to say, served them right. So this is some savage stuff going on. Let's bounce back to the conflagration of the doomed city. Let's see here where to go. So we're going to come back here, and where are we in this? We're going to 390. Right. So we got to scroll down a little bit. And what we're going to look at now is, why did the fire happen? Okay, we've talked a little bit about the drought and some of the other instances that might have caused it. And this book lays out a few other ideas as to what may have led to this. Now, you have to understand there's a lot of people that have opinions about what caused this. But the interesting part is, when it boils down to it, the really only thing we're going to look at is who benefits. And that's the question I like to ask when all this stuff happens, when that 2020 agenda happened. Who benefited from that? Wasn't you and I. And we're still paying the price. And then we're supposed to do our part for Ukraine. Well, our prices, our inflation is at an all-time high. We're in the middle of a recession. So it's always, there's always an angle to be played here, and someone's always looking to benefit, especially when there's a tragedy. And this is no different. It says, so let's think about, how did the fire start? The origin of the fire, to upsetting of a lamp in a cow barn, right? That's Mrs. O'Leary's cow. And that's been proven to be bullshit. Okay. She was escaping, and they actually cleared her a few years ago. There was actually a public ceremony to clear the O'Leary name, or at least Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, of setting the fire. Now, what's interesting though, and it says it right here, no investigation made since that chapter was written has disproved the theory therein set forth. So there was no investigation into what caused the fire. No further investigation. They just basically, the fire hit as soon as, no sooner than they put the fire out and cool the ground off, were they trying to rebuild. It's insane. But here's some ideas as to what caused it, or some excuses as to why it happened. The city was carelessly, and with the exception of a single square mile, very badly built. I would tend to disagree, because if we go back to the pictures we were looking at, that didn't look badly built. The weather at the time was remarkably dry. We've talked about that. The wind blew a steady gale, in almost fatal direction during the most prevalence of fire. Well, yes. And we know about weather manipulation, so it is possible for them to manipulate the wind. Am I saying it happened here? No. But we have to consider this even in 1872, because the same people, same groups that are running the show now were running the show back then. The fire department, though well equipped, is not well officered. So they had bad leadership. The fire department was particularly demoralized on the night of the fire. Well, yeah, they were overwhelmed. That's pretty obvious. Now, I also want to take a look at, can't really see it, American Apocalypse, okay, by Ross Miller, because in here he talks about what happened. And he says, in the districts where buildings had been constructed of stone or brick, people could barely locate the outlines of where they had once lived or worked, right? So these stone and brick neighborhoods destroyed. There's no outline of their house, building whatsoever. In places where the wooden structures predominated, absolute desolation was the rule. The same eyewitness continued, a stranger, ignorant on the occurrence of the fire, might have traveled over acres without scarcely meeting a single thing to even suggest that the areas through which he was passing had ever been inhabited. Another reported the city to be a place where human beings were doubtless so consumed as to leave no trace of their existence. So, and it goes on to say, particular at risk was the city's own version of manifest destiny, in which the city viewed itself as the beneficiary of uninterrupted development, right? They just thought they were going to grow and grow and grow. So what happens is we get into, few dreamed that the exquisite creation of genius, the handsome, massive marble structures, which had been compromised, which had comprised the wealth, the hope, the pride of the mercantile community, would prove but pasteboard obstacle in the checking, advancing flames. So even the marble and stone was no match for this flame. In the absence of any sure means of fireproofing, brick and stone, thought more resistant than wood, would be required at a cost dramatically increased over that of the balloon frame wood construction. So this is what we're looking at right here. What's going to happen is, and what's happening now in the housing market, is people are being priced out. Neighborhoods are being pushed out. Because what are the requirements going to be now? Well, after the insurance companies just got their ass handed to them, they're going to make sure that fireproofing is a requirement. Well, fireproofing comes with an extra cost. These people that were living here don't have the money to afford that. So what are they going to do? They're going to be forced to sell. And who's going to be there to swoop in? Those same guys you see in the pictures with their bowler hats, right? The robber barons. It's the same people that are swooping in today and buying up neighborhoods, buying up most of the majority of the real estate market, artificially driving up the price of these houses. It's going to crash, guys. It's inevitable, but it's planned. And the after effects of Chicago were planned as well. It says, by the better off, the fire was already being viewed philosophically as a necessary social hygiene or as a convenient redistributor of assets, which had happily attacked marginal residential areas and created more room for the city's growing commerce. Right? So they don't want necessary for social hygiene. That's a nice way of saying, cleaning out the lower classes, we'll say. Ethnic cleansing, in a sense, not to death, but of the area. He pointed out that the new fire laws did not help rehabilitate existing properties, but primarily aided speculators by forcing owners of lots where wood houses had formerly stood to sell their land at a loss. New brick and stone structures required capital that was not widely available in ethnic neighborhoods. Political reform burdened the social class least able to bear it. Okay, so those who can't afford it are being forced. And what happens? They can't afford it, so they're forced to sell, and forced to sell on the cheap because they have no choice. They're held by the proverbial balls. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. Again, who benefits? It's those guys in the bowler hats. And so we looked at that. Now let's take another look at a little bit more of the fires. Right here, we're going to go to 396. Let's go. Okay. So one of the interesting things, and I highlighted it over here, is during the 8 years prior to this fire in Chicago, how many fires were there by year? Well, 1863, there were 186 fires. 1864, 193 fires. 1865, 243. 66, 315. 67, 515. Huge jump, almost doubled. 1868 drops down by about 50 to 468. Then it bounces back up again to 490. And then 1870, we have 700 fires. Now, this does not give you the scale of the fire. Okay. Overall losses, though, it says was about 2.3 million, which is interesting because in 1870, but yet when you had 500 fires in 1867, you lost $4.2 million worth of property. So what you're seeing here is insurance companies are getting their ass handed to them, and they're going to make sure that things change. And who's going to pay the price? It's going to be the little guy. It always is. It's us, the common folk, the middle class, the lower class, not the wealthy. The wealthy benefit from these. And that's what we have to understand in this realm, is that the wealthy benefit from suffering. And that's fine because they can benefit from it all they want. I want no part in that benefit. I will not profit off someone else's suffering. Okay, so let's go to It's going to talk about the scene of the fire. One after another report. Oh, this is at the Tribune building, I believe. Yes. One after another, the reporters came in. Now, mind you, the Tribune building was supposed to be fireproof. For the third time, one after another, the reporters came in without the usual jocularity, took their places in the local room in the top story of the Tribune building, and commenced desperately at their task. One or two were set to watch from the roof the progress of the devastation, others writing out what they had already seen. Johnny English, the regular nightly reporter whose chief glory was in the fire of the first magnitude, came in declaring that he had matter enough to keep him writing for a week. To work, they all went to resolutely wrestled with their task, a greater one than mortal will ever yet achieve, and adequately describe the sublime event. Walls were toppling around them, flames mounting above them, the ground shaking like an earthquake beneath them, the red foe glaring in the windows and crackling, hissing, and roaring in their cars or in their ears. But they still rode on. So these people, they're just writing, right? This apocalyptic scene is going on around them, and these people are writing. That's dedication, and give them credit for it. The buildings at the north across the street were all mown down like grass, and still they rode on. Now this is where it starts becoming fantastical. The fireproof post office went, and they still rode on. The Reynolds block opposite them, invested by the flames. The large plate glass panes of the Tribune windows began to snap under the intense heat, and still they wrote on. Okay. And it says, for gas jets had already ceased to flow. In the lurid light, the twofold heat of the fire without the building and the fire within their own breasts, these artisans completed their work, emptied their last take, and consigned the turtles to the pressmen far below. These fellows proved unequal to the emergency, and pleading a lack of water for steam to run their engines, which may have been true, they fled, leaving the forms upon the huge press and the candles suddenly obtained glimmering uselessly about the tables. And it just starts a huge fire. And so the Tribune building ends up going up as well. So that's Chicago. And what we saw is just madness. It's just pure and utter devastation. It's something, I mean, we listened to those descriptions of the fire. I mean, the fire was jumping rivers, jumping buildings. It was hundreds of feet in the air. I mean, I can't imagine. And this is all happening at night. So it's dark. You don't know where to go. They run to the river. Some people ran back into the fire, and their whole thing was they were going to go into it, which is madness in itself. Think about the stress that someone has to be under for their survival instincts to just leave. The natural instinct to flee fire leaves you, and you're stuck in a mental fog where you run into the fire. Now that's something I can't really imagine. So we're gonna stop share. We're gonna share this one more time. Period. Let's go. So now what we're looking at here, and we'll get into this later, but this is some of the other great fires over time. You know, Moscow in 1812. It has London, I think, in 1666. We have New York a couple times, Charleston, Pittsburgh, Philly, San Francisco, Philly again, Chicago in 1857, 1859, 1866, and 1868, Portland. And then, so what we're going to talk about, this is the start of what we consider the Peshtigo fires. This is the Wisconsin and Michigan. This is their take on it. And we're also in the next episode, we're going to take a look at Reverend Peter Pennan's firsthand account of the Peshtigo fires. But the reason why I wanted to go over this is because there's some very good details in here. And when they start describing fire balloons, I'm all in because I've never heard anything like this in my life. So let's see if I can get this down to a single page. I want to make it a little easier to read here. Okay. So, all right. So what we have here is describing Wisconsin. And so it says Sunday evening after church, about a half an hour death-like stillness hung over the doomed town. The smoke from the fires in the region around was thick as to this stifling, and then hung the funeral pall on everything, and all was enveloped in Egyptian darkness. Now, Egyptian darkness, I found that to be an interesting description there. Soon, light puffs of air were felt. The horizon on the southeast, southwest began to be faintly illuminated. A perceptible trembling of the earth was felt, and a distant roar broke in awful silence. People began to fear that some awful calamity was impending, but yet no one dreamed of the danger. So listen to that. A perceptible trembling of the earth was felt. A distant roar broke the silence. So the ground is shaking from this. This is, and that's why I cannot believe that this is just coincidence that there's 3 fires here. It sounds like something happened to set off this ring of fire around Lake Michigan. The illumination soon became intensified into a lurid glare. The roar dispensed into a howl, as if to see demons of the internal pit had been let loose. When the advance gusts of wind from the main body of the tornado struck, chimneys were blown down, houses unroofed, and amid the confusion, terror, and terrible apprehensiveness of the moment, the fiery element in tremendous enrolling billows and masses of sheeted flame enveloped the devoted village. The frenzy of despair seized on all hearts. Strong men bowed like reeds before the fiery blast. Women and children, like frightened specters, flitting through the awful gloom, were swept away like autumn leaves. Crowds rushed for the bridge, but the bridge, like all else, was receiving the baptism of fire. Hundreds crowded into the river. Cattle plunged in with them, and being huddled together in general confusion. I can't see that. Okay. A great many were blazing on the bridge when it fell. The debris from the burning town was hurled over on the heads of those who were in the water, killing many and maiming others, so that they gave up in despair as they sank to a watery grave. The following account by an intelligent correspondent who traveled over the burnt district after the fires is the fullest and most circumstantial that has been furnished, and we give it the entire. So this is about a guy who just basically is traveling around the area for 10 days. Okay, he went from Chicago to Peshtigo, and he's just bouncing around from fire to fire. And he said the fire came sweeping through the forest towards these towns, threatening destruction to everything in its path. The first patient here he is, he goes to a hospital. Okay, so this is some of the victims. The first patient on the right as you enter is an American who has with him his wife, baby, and 5 other children. 3 of the latter are half-breeds by a former wife, a squaw from the Stockbridge tribe, whose reservation is located in the burnt district. The story of this man is the same in substance as that of some of the others. The fire approached them so unexpectedly that they had to run for their lives without saving anything but the clothes they had on. They reached a small pond of water where they sat for many hours until the fury of the fire had passed. When terribly burned as they were, they managed to reach help and were brought to town for properly cared for. Strange as it may seem, that while the half-breed children of this family were the worst burned, they exhibited stoical indifference to pain of their people, while the other children, all white, moaned loud enough to be heard all over the room. The next patient, an old German, 76 years of age, from the lower bush country, who lost his wife, daughter, son, and 8 grandchildren. The old man bore up a wonderful fortitude under all his afflictions. So, I mean, this guy lost everything. Absolutely everything. It's just unbelievable. He said, the street where we now pass along is lined with the best houses of the town. Here stood the fire engine house, a small frame structure just large enough to hold a steam fire engine. The cupola was open woodwork, but so intense was the heat that the bell, weighing several hundred pounds, was melted up. A little further along are shown a train on a platform cars loaded with green lumber that stood at the time of the fire, all of which was destroyed, excepting the iron wheels, which are partly melted. Okay, this was hot enough to partially melt iron wheels. The force of the tornado was so great that one carload of lumber was carried more than 100 feet where it burned. Here to the right was the company storehouse, which was immense building. In the debris, we find spoons by the dozen, all melted together. Stovepipes melted into balls not larger than your fist. Crockery, chains, glass, and hardware all run together, showing the great intensity of the heat. Some hundreds of feet to the right and rear of the last building stands only home left of the once flourishing town. The house had a gable end frontling to the river, with an L on the upper side that was not finished. The fire struck the L, which was destroyed in almost time it takes to tell it, but such a velocity of the wind after the wing was burned off, the fire was actually blown off, passing into the timber a few feet away, and the main house was saved. It's just it's the bell melted, steel train wheels partially melted. Guys, this isn't a normal fire. The heat of that fire must be so intense. Think about that, to melt steel. Wood fires do not melt steel. A few rods down the river from this building were a number of boards in the river, forming a platform some 12 feet square upon which 28 persons got for safety. After the fire was over, they discovered that their platform was buoyed up by 17 barrels of benzene, which fortunately did not burst and ignite, or the destruction of life would have been frightful. Only a few 100 feet below, on the same side of the river, were 500 people in the water, and the benzene on fire would have floated right down among them. And it is my judgment that every one of them would have been destroyed. The company had erected a fine bridge across the river, which was destroyed, fortunately, after most of the people had crossed over safely. There is a temporary structure in its place over which we pass and stop at the barracks, where we find Mr. Burns, the company agent. How ironic, in all of this fire, is it that the agent's name is Mr. Burns? I don't know about you, but I just find that utterly ironic. Burns said the fire came creeping slowly up the main street of the side of the town, first reached by the fire, went up the front door of the Congregational Church, hesitated a moment at the doorknob, then quickly reached the spire. And in 3 minutes, every house in town was on fire. 3 minutes. And in 1 hour, all that remained of the town was the unfinished home before alluded to. Just devastation. Okay, so here's another. My letter yesterday described the situation at Peshtigo, and today I write to you from Lower Sugar Bush country, the most desolate part of the burnt region. So he's in another region. So he witnesses an Indian burial. There were quite a few number of red faces present, all of whom joined in the solemn orgies. The deceased was a leading man of the Stockbridge tribe and had passed over to the beautiful hunting grounds of his forefathers after lingering illness. The body was placed in a plain box coffin. See here. Which contained all his belongings of a lifetime, such as a pipe, knife, and clothes. Okay, the coffin was carried by 3 braves, like a number of squaws, which heads uncovered, which were constantly repeating short Catholic prayers, as all Aborigines of the Stockbridge tribe had belonged to that church. So you're seeing already the Indians had been, kind of forced to join the tribe. Now, let's take a look here. Oh, no, we're going to skip Schwartz the Hermit. He's not important. So we're going to go down the well, about a half mile beyond on the right, and about 200 yards from the road are the remains of a dwelling which was occupied by a family named the Hill family. I think it's cut off right there. The family were all in the house at evening prayers when they were suddenly startled by a loud noise, much resembling continuous thunder. Again, we're hearing this roar, this thunderous like train. It's like if you're in a twister, right? A lot of people that have been near a twister describe it as a roaring train going by. So on the day, on going to the door, they found themselves entirely surrounded by fire. And as the only means of escape, the whole of them, 8 in number, went down into the well. Here they remained in safety until the wooden house covering the well caught fire, fell in, and burned the entire party to death. Another case exactly similar to the last was that of the Davis family in Peshtigo, who were all smothered to death in their well, into which they had descended in vain hope of saving their lives. I have heard quite a number of such cases, but as the facts were not definitely given, I make no mention of them. Guys, this is just desperation. It's so sad what these people are forced into. Here's the Lamp family. A short distance on, we come to a low stone wall, the foundation of a house, the former residence of the family named Lawrence, all of whom had perished. Immediately in front of this place is the ironwork of a wagon, which once belonged to Chase Lamp. Lamp lived in about a mile beyond, and when he found the fire approaching his house so rapidly, he hitched up his team and with his wife and 5 children drove all speed toward Peshtigo. In the very minutes after starting, he heard screams in the wagon and looked back and found the clothes of his wife and children were all ablaze. It was certain death to stop, and he therefore urged his horses to greater speed. But before moving many rods, one of the horses fell, and finding that he could not get up and seeing that all of his family was dead, Lamp started to save his life, which he did after being most horribly burned. He is now at the hospital at Green Bay and is slowly recovering. I mean, guys, this is just Just unbelievable death and devastation. Now, this is what I wanted to get to, fire balloons. We talked about that before, and I was like, what the hell is a fire balloon? I Googled fire balloons. I could not find anything. So, your readers may wonder what I mean by fire balloons, and I confess that I hardly know myself, and only using the term because it was so frequently used by others in conversation with me. And by others, he means firsthand accounts. All of the survivors with whom I conversed said that the whole sky seemed filled with dark, round masses of smoke about the size of a large balloon, which traveled with fearful rapidity. These balloons would fall to the ground, burst, and send forth a most brilliant blaze of fire, which they instantly consume everything in the neighborhood. An eyewitness who was in a pool of water and not far off told us about the balloon falling right down on the Lawrence family and burning them up. Now, when I hear fire balloons and I go into my conspiratorial brain, I start thinking Greek fire. And because what it says here, which would instantly consume everything in the neighborhood. That's what Greek fire did. Anything in its path, it consumed. Now, is there something above that is dropping these fire balloons, like an airship, maybe? I don't know. I'm just, like I said, I'm going out there with this, asking questions here, because I don't know. There's been, rumors of Napoleon using airships and airships being used even in this to maybe possibly start the fire, using some sort of mirror or glass type object with this in combination with the sun. There's all sorts of ideas out there, and we'll get into some of them. Some of them I didn't research all that much because I wanted to get more into the firsthand accounts. But let's get back to this. Passing on a mile or more, we reached the edge of a very small stream, on the bank which stood stately residence of Nathaniel May, one of the best farmers in northern Wisconsin, a man held to the highest estimation by all. At the time of the fire, a man named William Aldous and his wife and 3 children, residents of Western New York, were visiting at May's. The first intimation that any of them had a danger was the roaring of the flames in the woods, not more than 500 feet away. They all rushed out, but before they could reach the water 50 feet off, the flames struck them, and they all instantly perished. Instantly, guys. Mr. Newberry of our party with his family were in the water, not more than 100 feet from May's, and all they heard was Mrs. May crying out for her daughter, Lola, come this way, come with mother. A couple of days afterward, the burial party from Marinette visited the May farm and found the remains of them all close together, with the exception of the little girl, who was some distance off, showing that in the darkness she had accidentally been separated. I'll have more said about this brook near the May's house, but I will defer until I visit the Newberry Farms, which are about 1 mile further up. And it's interesting because Henry Newberry, a citizen of Connecticut, came to Wisconsin some 15 years ago with his family, consisting of a wife and 6 children. All right, I'm not going to get deep into them, but Sunday night, about 9 o'clock, the same day and hour the Chicago fire commenced, they heard a great roaring. And going out, Mr. Newberry found smoke so suffocating as to be almost unbearable. He started over to his brother's house a few rods off to see what must be done, but before he had gone far, was formed to return to his house. The noise was now of the appalling character, like a long peal of thunder or rapid discharge of heavy parks of artillery. The rear door was open, and it was only the greatest exertion that it was closed, which was no sooner than the flames blew through the cracks underneath, clear across the room. Mr. Newberry now knew that the only safety was in flight. So, taking their only children in their arms and accompanied by his wife and sister, they all fled, but where they knew not. At last, coming to the creek known as Little Trout, they found a pool of water some 6 inches deep, about 12 feet wide, and as many long. And being totally exhausted, here they sat down with their backs toward the fire. In an almost incredible short space of time, the fire was on all sides of them. The flames from May's barn and a heavy log bridge which spanned the creek in which they were sitting, almost reaching them. Here, they were expecting every moment to perish either by being burned to death or suffocated. Once in a while, they would feel a pleasant breeze from the bay when they would inflate their lungs to fullest capacity and then breathe as little as possible while the hot air was passing. They constantly threw water over themselves to keep their clothing from burning, which proved effectual. Strange as it may seem, the baby, which was resting in the father's arms in the water, slept the entire time, over 6 hours that they were there. When the fire had passed, the party crawled up the side of the creek and almost chilled to death, awaited the approach of daylight. A little later, they heard a man calling for help who, on coming to them, proved to be Charles Lamp, their neighbor. Lamp was blind and powerless, but he made reach the creek bank. As soon as it was light enough, Mr. Newberry started out to see what had become of his father, brothers, and sisters. A short distance off the bank of the creek, the bodies of 2 men, and a few feet further, the carcasses of several hogs and cows. Finding that he was too blind to go on, he cut off some of the meat from one of the cows and took it to his family, where they cooked and ate it. I mean, it's harrowing. So let's see, the Church family. Opposite where the Newberry house stood could be seen the debris marking the spot where they had stood, the residence of John Church, the village blacksmith, a man respected by all. His household consisted of himself, his wife, son, and the latter a young man just of age. When the hurricane of fire came, again, hurricane of fire, you're hearing noises, hurricane, the old man and his wife appeared to despair, but the son started on the race to life himself. He had only ran about 10 rods, or finding the escape impossible, he deliberately took out his knife and cut his throat from ear to ear, dying, as was supposed, almost instantly. The only living tree or plant to be seen in all the region are 2 or 3 strawberry plants on Mr. Newberry's farm, which on account the direction of the wind from some of the other cause was not burned. Mr. Newberry, in describing the fire, said that it seemed to him that the elements were on fire with fervent heat. The flames were rolling along hundreds of feet high above the tops of the highest trees and seemed to travel with lightning speed. I am not surprised at any opinion, however exaggerated, but for my own part, concluded that there was not any outside influence at work. The fire, which had been burning for weeks in the marshes, suddenly fanned into the power by the force of the tornado, reached into the heavy pine timber, which is, as well known, contains large percentage of resinous matter, and it was carried along, gaining such momentum that it would appear the very heavens were being consumed, causing many, even intelligent persons, to conclude in the day of judgment the hour of complete total destruction was at hand. To the west of the Newberry settlement, there were many fine farms, and of all the persons that lived in that direction for about 5 miles, hardly one was saved. It seemed to matter little whether they lived near timber or the counter of large clearings. The doom was the same. I mean, this is some rough stuff. So let's go. A path through the fire. And returning about a mile north, we came to Adnan Newton's farm. where 16 persons were burned to death. As soon as Newton saw the fire, he started out to see what was best to be done. Running down to the road, he found himself headed off by the flames. Turning back, he saw his family and his workmen in the yard coming toward him. But when they noticed him turn back, they also changed their course. In an intent more, they were all on fire and must have perished in a moment. Newton happened to notice on his right what proved to be the path through the flames, about 50 yards wide, for which he rushed and continued for 3/4 of a mile. When he came to a house still occupied by several persons, they all invited him to come into the house, but he declined, saying he would rather trust being saved in the small pond of water close by. And another distant house was on fire, and before the inmates could get to him, they were all burned to death, while Newton escaped, pretty well singed. I had a conversation with Newton, and he declared that he had no hankering after another such race. The second day after the fire, 33 remains were found in 3 farms. Ugh. Nothing was saved. I mean, this is the only house left, right? One house was saved. And then we're going to look about at the Spears place. And this is in Wisconsin in November 9th. This is about a month after. The farm owned by Louis E. Spear, an excellent citizen who, with his wife and 2 children, perished while attempting to escape from the fearful blast. Thought we were talking about fires. Now we're talking about explosions. They only reached a point a few hundred yards from their house when they fell to rise no more. While 2 Indians who were at the house when the fire commenced saved themselves by getting into a small creek, which is to be seen a short distance on the opposite side. They had their woolen blankets, and which they had thrown over their heads and kept wetted down. This would preserve that seems very strange, as the fire in the timber was not more than 20 feet off from where they sat, and that the intensity of the heat was so great that a stove in a house not more than 3 rods away was melted. The Pedigree farm was the next one we visited, where the destruction is fully as great as in every other quarter. Everything is gone. One total wreck. Not a house, barn, fence, or tree. Not even the soil itself being left. The first warning any of them had was the low, rumbling noise heretofore described. The wife went to the door, found fire on every side of them, and believing the day of judgment was at hand, without an effort to save themselves, they all perished. Mr. Beebe, the Peshtigo company's agent, as soon as he saw the fire, declared that the last hour had come, and although repeatedly requested to save himself, refused to do so, and perished without an effort to get away. This is what I'm talking about. These people didn't even try to get away. The last seen of him, he was in his front door with his hands clasped, claiming, "Great God, thy will be done, and to thee I entrust my soul." In the center of a large sandy field, hundreds of yards from any timber or house, stood a stamp, which was entirely destroyed, down to even the roots, leaving the ground like just so much a honeycomb. A few rods off was a carcass of a cow, with a bell which had been around its neck lying near, in a half-melted condition. It's melting bells. All of your readers have undoubtedly visited houses which have been totally destroyed, and noticed the stoves and other articles of iron in all the cellars of which were in good condition, excepting they were perhaps warped or discolored. but I doubt whether they ever saw such things melted, a sight to be seen here. Wherever debris of a home is to be found, the iron of the stoves and even the wrought iron pipe being melted up. In one cellar, I think that the house of a formerly occupied Caro family, I found 3 smoothing irons melted together so as to all lift out and adhere together. This was one of the finest specimens to be found anywhere. Think about that. That heat is not generated by a wood fire. I'm sorry. It does not make sense. Just beyond the cemetery was a stone wall, at least 1 full mile from the nearest timber in the direction from which the fire came. Yet so intense was the heat that the stones cracked into minute pieces. And in many places, the sandstones actually melted, leaving a glass surface, something like potteryware. Near here, the road is quite sandy, and the surface melted down, leaving a crust on the surface of a glassy nature. Whenever the sand was blown against the trees, the wood presented a smooth appearance, just as if it had been covered with melted glass. Guys, what kind of weapons have we heard of that melt glass? Atomic, nuclear, massive bombs? This doesn't sound like normal fire. It says, leaving the hardwood country, we enter where only a short time ago were vast forests of huge pines, fully as large as any I had ever expecting in Oregon. The trees are now mostly uprooted and leveled with ground, presenting as complete an abatis as could be desired by the most skilled military commander. I could go on and give any number of sights to be seen in this desolated country, but as they are only repetitions of what has already been written. Therefore, content myself by saying that after passing through many miles of barren territory, where all was once prosperous, we return to Menominee, ready to visit the peninsula and Michigan, where the fires were fully as severe in this section. I'm sorry, it says Michigan. It's this typewriter print. Okay. And we're going to wrap up here in a minute. We have like 1 or 2 more pages and we'll get out of here. But I want to hit up these last couple accounts here. And it says, I must say, after a full investigation, I have come to the conclusion that there is too much committee entirely, and that the work would have been pushed through more rapidly had fewer persons been held responsible for the task. Again, this is what we see with all these committees, right? The JFK committee, 9/11 committee, any of these big committees, nothing gets done. They just become this big monster that can't get out of their own way. So we have another account. You can imagine a beautiful and thriving village with its immense manufactories and busy life, now waste of sand, deserted. The carcasses of 50 horses lay in regular rows as they had stood in their stalls, with scarcely a vestige of building remaining. The people only 10 minutes warning of the hurricane of fire and no time to comprehend the situation. They rushed into the streets, started for the river, but were overtaken by the storm of fire and fell in the middle of the streets. Again, hurricane. What type of winds radiate from what we're told is a nuclear blast? Gale force hurricane winds. The half has not been told. The whole will never be known. The loss of life increases every hour. On Friday, last 26 dead bodies were found in the woods, and on Saturday, 36. The woods and fields are literally full of dead bodies, and many were burned entirely up. We found some teeth, a jackknife, and a slate pencil. It must have been all remained of a promising boy. Then came light gusts of wind, and in the south was seen, through the smoke and darkness, faint glimmers of light. The earth trembled, and roar of approaching tornado and the shock of the falling trees broke the awful stillness. No one could realize the approaching danger when, in almost a moment, the Holocaust was upon them. There it is, guys. And this is from 1872. The fire, in its maddening rage, could not keep pace with the wind, and trees and houses and men were blown down that they might be rapidly consumed. Men, women, and children rose again to rush like specters through the flames and fell separated from each other. In this terrible moment, men thought that the final day had come when the earth should be burnt, and bowed themselves to offer the last prayer. More might have been saved if this conviction had not seized them. The drought and tornado, which brought disaster to Chicago, brought this also. These forest fires prevailed the most destructively in Door, Kewaunee, Oconto counties, Wisconsin, all of which were so desperately devastated as to leave no vestige of property remaining to its owners except the bare land. In open fields, the destruction were more complete than in pine forests, where the trunks of green trees were still standing, though nearly worthless. In each of a dozen more townships, from 20 to 80 dead bodies are found. Only those who had time and presence of mind enough to escape to a freshly plowed area escaped a fiery death. The fatalities were increased greatly by the suddenness which with the tornado of fire swept upon them, and the impression it made the majority of the people on the day of judgment had arrived, from which there was no escape. The loss of life in Wisconsin is estimated at 1,000, which, if you think about it, that is, that's pretty damn low for what it could have been. I mean, I would say that's a win right there, if that's all they had to worry about. I just want to see here. The fires. Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. We can pick up. Yeah, we'll pick up next time. Let me just mark that here. We're going to pick up next time, and we're going to go over the Peshtigo fires again a little bit more. We're going to look into Peshtigo, Lake Michigan, or not Lake Michigan, on the other side of Lake Michigan in Michigan. We're going to look at Manistee, and then we're also going to obviously look at Reverend Peter Pennant's account of this. But in addition, we're going to look at the possible ties of a comet. And there's a couple different possibilities that could be. And actually, let me share that. Let's see here. Run Finder. Okay. So we go here, and we're going to bring this up. So we're in the pictures, and what we're looking for is, okay, so here's the areas they're talking to. Pensaki, Encanto, here's Peshtigo up here. Minicon is up here. This is the lower sugar bush we were talking about earlier. And guys, look at the Green Bay, okay? The fire jumped across the bay. How is that possible? Fire jumped across the bay. I mean, we look at the devastation, and it's just remarkable churches, you know, and here's Chicago. It wasn't that bad, all things considered. Could have been much, much worse. Much, much worse. They got lucky. But we're talking in Peshtigo, we're talking about, you know, utter devastation. Now, could it be from a comet? Because Biela's comet is rumored to have been in the area. And just look at the pictures. These are, oh man, brick buildings just burnt. Tribune building, permanent, just gutted. It's heart-wrenching seeing these buildings. I mean, look at the just the destruction in the city. People fleeing. You know, and again, this is nighttime, so the mayhem just must have been crazy. But this picture here, I wanted to show you before we get out of here. And for those listening, it's them rebuilding, and almost immediately. Like I said, and this explains some of the earlier pictures. Let me see if I can get over there. And again, guys, notice who's always in these pictures. One of these jerk-offs in the black suit and hat, posing with the rubble. Post office. This is a famous one with these two posing. But I wanted to show you, I think it's coming up. This one. Okay, because I'm going to correct myself. In a previous podcast, when I was talking about the fires, I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense because you have this big building back here and these big buildings back here not destroyed, but these little wooden shanties are still up. Well, that's because after doing more research, those were built almost immediately. And again, like I said, as soon as they could build something back up, they were getting structures going back up. Even if they were these little wood shanties, just something, they were going to rebuild. And that's, you know, what you're going to see if we get into the rebuilding of Chicago after the fact, which I think eventually I will get into because I find that is an interesting story. Again, you get multiple characters who are assigned these monumental tasks of, but the devastation here, guys, look at the bricks just destroyed. Remember that bell was melted, steel melted. What makes fires hot enough to melt steel? It's not wood. It's not a wood-fueled fire. I can tell you that. So what caused it? And why do these scenes look like scenes out of World War II after a bombing raid? Right? This could be Dresden. This could be London after the bombing raids. But this is a fire. And this fire goes, again, look at this jerk off with the hat and the suit. This fire covers hundreds of miles. Millions of acres are burnt. Thousands of buildings are lost. Okay, so you want an idea. Let me give you an idea. I'll share the computer sound. Okay, I will play this little clip right here, and we're going to head out after this. But this is just to give you an idea of what it would, you know, is the act rendering of it, what it would have been like on the streets of Chicago during the fire.
This is Grant Holcomb again. I'm here with Bill Keneally, where we've met, and we're right in the center of town. The fire is moving like a blowtorch. It's jumping ahead far beyond the tired men who are trying to stop it. I'd say it's roaring at about 100 yards a minute.
Fleet Roberts, we're a few blocks away from the waterworks. Fire is moving directly northeast. It has not changed its course.
Just look at the chaos on the street. Firefighters are trying to get to the fire. People are trying to run away. You have wagons, horses running around on wooden sidewalks that are catching on fire, with walls collapsing on people.
Mob to see if we can reach the waterworks
Police
ourselves, but it's
and vigilante groups are trying to, you know, keep some order of what's left. You got people just carrying whatever they can carry along with them. It's just pure mayhem. Not something I want to be a part of. Hell on earth.
There's a woman caught on the second floor window.
Woman caught on fire, second floor window. Boom,
Oh, that
jumps
was
out. Unbelievable. Wow. So, and again, here's another picture, guys. Look at the devastation, and then right here in the middle, they rebuilt. Okay, they made sure they were rebuilding quickly. Again, two jerk-offs over here posing with their work. The devastation. Think about it. Okay, and we're gonna go over it some more as we get through. But and here's some of the buildings after. The Grand Palace Hotel, 1873. Honorary Block, 1872. Palmer House, 1875. The Honorary Hotel, 1872. The Third Courthouse, 1885. The Board of Trade, 1883. They're putting up these massive structures as fast as possible. And this was actually, here's a picture of the first building that that was built after the fire. And of course, we have men in bowler hats, hands in pockets, as you would expect. So, with that said, this is a good place to stop for now. Again, guys, go check out the Patreon, patreon.com, The Great Deception Podcast. We've got a couple different tiers out there. Patreon call, patron Zoom call this Friday, October 28th, 8:30 Eastern. I will have a link for all the patrons out there on Friday for you. I look forward to it, guys. It's a great conversation. Get to meet some new people, throw around some ideas, and just really, I got to say, guys, you are the best. The people that listen to this show and I interact with on a daily basis, there are one or two of you that are a royal pain in the ass, and I even love you because you bring a different angle. And you could, hey, everybody has their approach. Some people are just assholes. I may be one of them. Depends which side of me you bring out. And that's on you. But hey, I respect a good asshole. As long as you got a good heart, man. There's assholes out there that they're just there to make you better. And I feel that. I respect that. But then there's just fucking trolls out there that they can just go to hell because they're just worthless pieces of shit that do not deserve the any breath, any time of day. They just, you need to ignore and move on. But good listeners that provide interaction and question you and make you think about things. That's what this is about. Questioning everything. And we're going to get deeper into this next time. So we're going to get into the Peshtigo fire a little bit more. Here's some more crazy firsthand accounts of things that fire's doing, immense heats. And then we're going to look at the comet angle and maybe some other angles as to what could be potential causes. Like we talked about, possibly energy weapons, direct energy weapons. So thank you all. I appreciate it. Everyone stay strong and question everything.